Welcome to Cleveland Park Congregational United Church of Christ. We are an open and affirming congregation committed to racial justice. Whoever you are and wherever you are on life's journey, you're welcome here with us. We'd like to extend a special welcome to anyone visiting with us today. We're glad that you're here, and we invite you to sign our guest book before you leave if you would like to hear from our pastor after the service sometime this week, probably. Well, we have a couple of special things happening today. One is we have coffee hour, and thanks to Nancy and Christina for helping to host that. I'd also like to give a special thanks to our other volunteer helpers today, Catherine and Dan, for worship support and tech support. And we hope everyone will join us for coffee hour. We are going to have a special coffee hour conversation today. We're going to be joined by Richard Bombach and Bob Ward, who are going to talk about racially restrictive covenants here in Cleveland Park and also our own church's history in that regard. So we do hope that you'll join us for that. We also are taking up a special collection today. We sometimes do this a couple of times during the year for the UCC. Today's collection is called Neighbors in Need. And this is a UCC fund that supports local ministries of justice throughout the U.S. And there's a special focus on mental health justice this year. There are two ways you can donate. One is if you happen to have a checkbook with you, you can write a check to our church and write Neighbors in Need in the subject line. Assuming that a lot of people don't carry checks anymore, you can also go online and do it there. And there's a link in the bulletin you can find. Also later today, the poetry group will be meeting online at 4 o'clock. And if you'd like more information about that, you can talk to Lee back there at the back. And next Sunday, there's going to be a Bible discussion group meeting after coffee hour, so you can find out more information about that and also about some other upcoming events in the bulletin. And also the other exciting thing happening today is that we're going to have some bagpipes later in the service. So thanks to Beatrix for playing for us today. And I think with that, I'm going to remind everyone to make sure your electronic devices are muted, and I will turn things back over to Pastor Ellen. Thanks for coming this morning.
Thank you, Lisa. And welcome, everyone. It is such a gorgeous fall day. After that 2-week period of rain, we're now just getting day after day of just beautiful, beautiful fall. I just want to reiterate what Lisa said about joining us after worship for coffee hour, and also to say that Nancy Paulo is the one who provided our coffee hour refreshments, but she had a little emergency she needs to take care of this morning, and so Christina and Catherine are making our coffee and making sure that those wonderful refreshments are put out for us. In addition, I just really do hope that you'll join us after worship for the coffee hour conversation. Not just because it's going to be a super interesting conversation about our own church's role in the racially restrictive covenant, sadly, of the 1920s, but also because Richard Bombach, our 90-year-old church historian, is going to join us by Zoom, but it is going to be his last time joining us by Zoom living in the DC area, because he and his wife Susan are moving up to West Virginia to be closer to family next month. So look forward to having many of you join us for this. We begin, as always, thank you to Ren and to Lila, by lighting our candles of hope and healing for the world. And the challenge is that we first have to light the candle lighters. May this light illumine all places, beings, and situations without exception, near and far. Please join me for the call to worship. O God, you have told us the first shall be last, and the last shall be first. Good job. Good job. We wonder what this looks like and when it will begin. Jesus said he came to bring good news to the poor. And let us join together in prayer. God of all people, we know you love us unconditionally. We also know you have a heart for the poor and a deep weariness for people who make the lives of others more difficult. We confess that many of us live far beyond the means of our planet's ability to support us. We confess that many of us consume far more than our community's share of resources, leaving others in need. God of manna and mercy, help us to trust in empathy over excess, compassion over currency, and mutual aid over mutual funds. We cannot store our riches in heaven. What matters is the treasure in our hearts. Amen. Please rise in body and or spirit as you are able for our opening hymn. I now invite you to join in the time of silent reflection. When we gather for worship, we heed God's call and honor our need for Sabbath and rest. When we enter into silence, we attune our hearts and open our minds to a presence greater than our own. As we begin this short period of meditation, I encourage you to bring your full self to this present moment. Set aside any distractions, lay down your burdens, and take a deep, life-giving breath. God is with us. Let us reflect upon the week that has passed. What are the joys we have celebrated? And what concerns have we endured? Are there things we have done that we ought not to have done? And are there things we have left undone that we ought to have done? As we look forward to the week ahead, what help will we need from God or neighbor? And what can we do to nurture love of God and love of neighbor in the world? We'll close in prayer. Source of life, for the joys we have celebrated, we give you thanks. God of compassion, for the concerns we have endured, please tend our hearts. Spirit of justice, for those things we have misdone, transform us with your love. Companion God, as we look forward to the week ahead, be ever present with us. And great lover of all, as we seek to nurture love of God and neighbor in the world, guide our actions and our prayers. Amen. In the Gospel of Matthew, Jesus says, "Come to me, all you who are weary and carrying heavy burdens, and I will give you rest." What I want to say to you this morning before I preach about the rich man and the camel and the needle is that I understand that even those of us who have material wealth suffer the burden of being human in this world. We suffer illness, age, ruptured relationships, disappointment, and all of us, ultimately, death. So I say to you that we are each loved, no matter what we have done or do, or what we have left undone or do not do. God is with us, and God's boundless mercy forgives us. I invite you to pray. God of manna and mercy, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done, on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our debts as we forgive our debtors. Lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. For thine is the kingdom, and the power, and the glory forever. Amen. I now invite all those online to unmute and those in the sanctuary to turn and share the peace and love of God with your neighbor in the pew. May peace be with you.
Peace, everyone.
Be peace with you.
with you.
Hi, Alan.
Peace be with you. All right, welcome back, everyone. And someone may have already done this, but if not, if someone could go downstairs and let the teen group know that Beatrix will be playing momentarily. I know they really would like to hear her, so. She may be going down to get her bagpipes and letting them know, but just want to make sure. All right, so while we're waiting for, I guess that was a spoiler, right? Okay, while we're waiting for Beatrice and her bagpipes, I would like to invite any children and youth to come up, or anybody else who would like to. Hello, Marion. For those who don't know, Marion is our Sunday school coordinator and teaches our lower grades class, which is meeting this morning with our teen group downstairs. Our middle grades class will be meeting next week. All right, so I was thinking that because we actually have a few visitors today, which is wonderful. Welcome, welcome. And we also have some folks that we know pretty well and that are living someplace really different right now. And no pressure, James, but you want to let us know where you and Beatrix have been living this fall? They're going to school in Scotland. Yeah, so Beatrix has been there, what, the past 2 years? Or 1 year-ish? Okay, all right. And so James, this is your first time over there this fall, right? Okay, so that's pretty far away. And I guess really while we're waiting for Beatrice to come up with her bagpipes, which we can't wait to hear, what I really most wanted to talk about this morning is friendships and how they can carry on no matter how far away people are, and that we can love people even when they're long distance. And so I'm curious if any of you have long distance friends, in addition, of course, to Beatrix and James. Yeah, okay, Aurora does. Aurora, you want to tell us about it in the microphone?
I have a friend that lives in San Jose or San Francisco.
Okay, so she lives in Northern California, or he? She, okay. And how often do you get to see her?
I only really get to text her.
You text her? Okay, so you stay in touch with her by texting. You live in the 21st century, you're lucky that way, right? Yeah. Anybody else? Anybody else have a long distance friend? Or maybe a friend from camp in the summer that you only see in the summer? No other long distance friends? How about cousins that you only, oh,
Okay, so I have so many cousins that.
you have so many cousins? Okay, tell us.
Yeah, I text.
You text, and where do they live?
Wait, Long Island.
Long Island, okay. You want to think? Okay, Daphne, what about you?
I have some cousins who live in Andover, some cousins who live in Michigan, and some cousins who live in Seattle.
Okay, and do you,
And Ohio.
whoa, okay, you've got a
And
lot
New
of
Hampshire.
cousins. So do you get to see them ever in person?
Yeah, I see them sometimes.
Oh.
We're going to see some for New Year's.
New Year's, okay, and then between times, do you email or text or phone, or is there, write letters or cards?
Yeah, we call them sometimes.
You call them sometimes? Okay. It looked like Lila had something she wanted to add.
I have a friend that goes that used to be into the city.
What's her name, Lila?
Amelia.
Amelia used to live right across from the church, and she just moved to the Chesapeake Bay.
Oh, wow. Okay. So, yeah, so she's not close anymore. But, you know, when you get to visit her at the Chesapeake Bay, that'll be a pretty neat place to visit, right? Excellent. Excellent. All right. Well, so our friend Beatrix, I think, is ready. Yes, here she is. All right, Beatrix, you missed our whole friend conversation, but here's our friend Beatrix, and she is going to play a selection of Scottish tunes, I believe 4 different short tunes. And do you want to tell us what the names of them are? Because I certainly can't remember. Where's the, oh, here, I'll give you a microphone so that the people online can hear also. You can stand wherever you want. And you all can stay up here if you want, wherever you want to be.
Okay, well, I just kind of decided this a couple minutes ago. The Pumpkins Fancy, Bronny's Blue Brosy, Beaches of Harris, The Red Coat, The Ale is Dear, and Dr. McPhail of Tyree.
All right, excellent. A bunch of Scottish ditties. All right, wonderful. Thank you. was so awesome. I am guessing that these kids might actually, can I give you a hug first? Yeah. I'm guessing they might actually have some questions for you because that, I mean, geez, how does that even work, right? Do you all have any questions that you want to ask Beatrix? Or anyone else? Yes, Alan, okay. No, you need the microphone. Those online want to hear your brilliant question.
Thanks for letting me ask this stupid question.
Okay.
What's the tassel all about?
Ah, yes. They'll just go like that. Got it. Okay. A good question. That wasn't a stupid question. No stupid questions ever. All right, Aurora.
How does it make so many different sounds of like different instruments?
Oh, yeah.
Right, well, we have the chanter, that has 9 notes.
Oh, yes. Sorry. Yes.
So this is the chanter, and it has 9 notes, and it's tuned to, so it's in D major, it's D flat. And then you have the drones, which are kind of like, it's like the wah, which is tuned to the low A on your chanter. So you have these going like the whole time, while these are making different notes.
Okay, so what I'm hearing is that each of these is sort of their own separate instrument in some ways.
Sort of, yeah. These three work together to produce sort of like a background melodic kind of thing, and then these are the more interesting things. And you can do all sorts of things with these 9 notes to make, the little like da-da kind of sounds. Yeah.
Cool. Did that answer your question? Yes? Did you have a follow-up to that, Marion?
I just wanted to know if it was heavy.
Oh, well, you can feel it. Like, these are relatively light. They're quite skinny as far as These are relatively light. They're quite skinny as far as most pipes go, but they're not super light. But,
Edmund?
What kind of reeds do you have that make the noise?
Yeah, so this is so the reed in the chanter, which has the 9 notes, it's a cane reed. So it's not like a flat thing. It's more similar to, I guess it's sort of similar to like a saxophone or other woodwind instruments, but it's just, here, I can actually. Oh. It's sort of like that. So you can blow on it, and that's what makes the 9 notes. And then in the drones, I have cane reeds, so it's all cane, but they're quite long, and they have one big tongue on them, if you know about reeds, And then you have a band, and you can move it up and down, and it changes how much air can get into them.
So they're a double reed, like?
Yeah, so this is a double reed in the chanter, and then these are just long and have a single tongue on them.
Heidi? And then Margaret?
I actually have 2 questions. What made you decide to start learning the bagpipe, and how long did it take to get to like any level of proficiency where it didn't just seem like noise to you?
I started playing when I was 8-ish, because I saw a performance at the National Cathedral when I was 4, and I always wanted to do it, and then one day I did. So that means I've been playing for 8 years now. And it takes quite a bit of time because you start on like what's basically a recorder which has the notes, and then you slowly work your way up to having all 3 drones going. And it's not exactly a pleasant learning process for everybody who has to listen to it. But it takes quite a bit of time because there's so many things happening at once, and it's, maintaining control of the instrument and keeping the pressure on is like, it's a huge part, and, I'm still improving in that, and working on it.
I think you first played for us when you were like 11, so, you're okay. Okay. Anyone else? Yes? Lila.
Question?
Why does it have those holes in it?
What are those holes for?
Oh, yeah, okay. You mean the holes at the end? The holes at the end of those different pipes, or the holes that her fingers were going on? The holes at the end, right. Yeah, what are those for?
So they're basically to allow the air to come out. So you have It comes in from the bag. It travels all the way up through this and then comes out at the top. And when I'm tuning my drones, I can lengthen, like I can make the length of this shorter, or I can make it longer by moving these pieces up and down, and that changes how it sounds and how it's tuned.
Okay, anyone else? All right, then another round of applause. Thank you again so much. All right, and class, have fun with Marion. Try to beat that, Marion. Good luck with that, right? Alan will now read from the Book of Amos and Gospel of Mark.
A reading from the book of Amos. Therefore, because you trample on the poor and take from them levies of grain, you have built houses of hewn stone, but you shall not live in them. You have planted pleasant vineyards, but you shall not drink their wine. For I know how many are your transgressions, and how great are your sins. You who afflict the righteous, who take a bribe, and push aside the needy in the gate. Therefore, the prudent will keep silent in such a time, for it is an evil time. Seek good and not evil, that you may live. And so the Lord, the God of hosts, will be with you, just as you have said. Another reading from the Gospel according to Mark. As he was setting out on a journey, a man ran up and knelt before him and asked, "Good teacher, what must I do to inherit eternal life?" Jesus said to him, "Why do you call me good? No one is good but God alone. You know the commandments. You shall not murder. You shall not commit adultery. You shall not steal. You shall not bear false witness. You shall not defraud. Honor your father and mother." He said to him, "Teacher, I have kept all these since my youth." Jesus, looking at him, loved him and said, "You lack one thing. Go, sell what you own and give the money to the poor, and you will have treasure in heaven. Then come follow me." When he heard this, he was shocked and went away grieving, for he had many possessions. Then Jesus looked around and said to his disciples, "How hard it will be for those who have wealth to enter the kingdom of God." And the disciples were perplexed at these words. But Jesus said to them again, "Children, how hard it is to enter the kingdom of God. It is easier for a camel to go through the eye of a needle than for someone who is rich to enter the kingdom of God." They were greatly astounded and said to one another, "Then who can be saved?" Jesus looked at them and said, "For mortals it is impossible, but not for God. For God, all things are possible."
Thank you, Alan. As I sat down to write this sermon, I asked myself, why? I mean, it's 16 days before the election and life is challenging enough right now. Why on earth did I choose to preach on the rich man and Jesus? It was actually one of last week's lectionary readings, so I could have moved on. Yet something stopped me and called me to focus here. I'm glad I did, because it made me think, and I hope it will you as well. To begin, I'd like to reread the passage from Eugene Peterson's translation, The Message. Just hear it a little differently. As he went out into the street, a man came running up, greeted him with great reverence, and asked, "Good teacher, what must I do to get eternal life?" Jesus said, "Why are you calling me good? No one is good, only God. You know the commandments: don't murder, don't commit adultery, don't steal, don't lie, don't cheat, honor your father and mother." He said, "Teacher, I have, from my youth, kept them all." Jesus looked him hard in the eye and loved him. He said, "There's one thing left. Go sell whatever you own and give it to the poor. All your wealth will then be heavenly wealth. And come, follow me." The man's face clouded over. This was the last thing he expected to hear, and he walked off with a heavy heart. He was holding on tight to a lot of things and not about to let go. Looking at his disciples, Jesus said, "Do you have any idea how difficult it is for people who have it all to enter God's kingdom?" The disciples couldn't believe what they were hearing, but Jesus kept on. "You can't imagine how difficult. I'd say it's easier for a camel to go through a needle's eye than for the rich to get into God's kingdom." That got their attention. "Then who has any chance at all?" they asked. Jesus was blunt. "No chance at all if you think you can pull it off by yourself. Every chance in the world if you let God do it." This is a challenging passage for most of us here this morning, living in some of the richest zip codes in the wealthiest country on earth. I find it particularly unsettling in the context of an election that seems it may come down to the way people feel about the price of bread. A legitimate concern, except that both main candidates are largely ignoring the climate crisis and other effects of corporate and individual greed, and the impact these are having and will continue to have on the prices of staple items. Not to mention that other issue people claim to care most about, immigration. Of course, there's no mention at all of our bizarrely disproportionate military spending. It's as if we live in a parody of the world Jesus warned us about, kind of like the world he lived in, where the extreme disparity between rich and poor inspired him to make such a ludicrous claim as, "It's easier for a camel to get through the eye of a needle than for a rich person to enter the kingdom of God." What do we do with this? We take him seriously. We actually believe him when he says it's functionally impossible for people with an abundance of material wealth to enter God's kingdom, which I feel compelled to point out is counter to the ever more popular prosperity gospel message that preaches an individual's financial success is a sign of favor by God. Then we look at what it means to enter God's kingdom, all the while trusting the parts of the passage that tell us Jesus loved him, and with God, all things are possible. First, why is it so hard to enter God's kingdom if we're rich? And mind you, Jesus was talking about most of us, not just Elon Musk. To answer this question, it's important to understand what God's kingdom is. This passage is often mistranslated as, it's harder for a camel to go through the eye of a needle than a rich person to get into heaven. In other words, people turn it into an eternal salvation or damnation scenario. Then they spiritualize what it means to be rich or poor. But Jesus was specific about the man's wealth being material. Go sell what you have and give the money to the poor. And he named the kingdom of God, not some otherworldly realm. But what is the kingdom of God? I best understand it by relating it to the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.'s concept of beloved community. A society based on justice, equal opportunity, and love for one's fellow human beings. The beloved community has 5 pillars, including love, a selfless concern for others rooted in kindness, service, patience, gentleness, and forgiveness. Dignity. All people are worthy of respect and have an inherent worth to humankind. Intolerance. Poverty, hunger, and homelessness are not tolerated. Inclusiveness. Racism and other forms of discrimination are replaced by an all-inclusive spirit of kinship. And finally, reconciliation. Disputes are resolved through peaceful conflict resolution. Thus, God's kingdom, or beloved community, is radically different from Caesar's empire or the 21st century USA. In God's kingdom, there is no 1%. In God's kingdom, there aren't 140 million poor and low-income people living in the richest country on earth. Nor in God's kingdom is there a richest country on earth. Especially not one that with less than 5% of the world's population consumes 16 to 24% of the world's energy, 1/3 of the world's paper, 1/4 of the world's oil, 23% of the world's coal, 27% of the world's aluminum, 19% of the world's copper, and creates 30% of the world's waste. The United States of America is not the kingdom of God. We do not live in God's kingdom, the beloved community. And like the rich man in the story, many of us feel bad about this. But not bad enough to significantly change our behavior. Not bad enough to stop our excessive consumption. Not bad enough to stop blaming the other, whether that be the other political party, other people coming in from other countries or other colors, classes, cultures, or creeds. Jesus' question to us is simple. Do we actually want to live in God's kingdom? Or is it simply too daunting to create the sort of world we say we believe in, where all people have value, where poverty, hunger, and homelessness aren't tolerated, where discrimination is replaced by a spirit of inclusion and disputes are solved through peaceful conflict resolution? The response of the rich man in today's story is both heartbreaking and sobering. The man's face clouded over, This was the last thing he expected to hear. And he walked off with a heavy heart. He was holding on tight to a lot of things and not about to let go. But what if he had? What if he had let go? What would he have received in this process? This sharing of all he had with those who have nothing, and trusting that being part of God's kingdom is better than any bank account or trust fund or annuity. How might his hot loneliness have been replaced with community? How might his rugged individualism have been replaced with interdependence? In this so-called Christian country, I wish to God these were the questions we were asking, debating, and discussing. I wish we weren't such a huge, unwieldy, voracious camel. I wish our selfish, ignorant consumption would slow down. I wish we wouldn't continue to delude ourselves by obsessing over a growth economy in a world that can't even handle our current level of consumption. I wish we cared as much about our children and the world they'll inherit as we say we do. I wish we would listen to Jesus, who's trying to tell us something that's really hard to hear. What if the rich man had listened to Jesus? What if he, like the disciples who dropped their fishing nets, so much easier for those poor working class men, had been able to let go of his great wealth and follow him? What if he'd been able to share, not just donate to the poor? What if he'd been able to step off the moving sidewalk of material success and follow a different path? What if we were to do this? What if we were to take a risk and step off the merry-go-round? What might happen? Well, here we are, 16 days from the election. Some of us have already voted, and I pray we will all vote by the time the polls close on November 5th. As you do, I encourage you to consider God's kingdom, the beloved community, up and down the ballot. No candidate is perfect, just as no human is perfect. We're loved anyway. Yet there are those who really do believe in creating the beloved community, and those who emphatically do not. Which path will we choose? Remembering, with God, all things are possible. Amen. Please join me in a moment of meditation. It is now the time in our service when we share our deep joys and concerns, silently or out loud, with God and with one another. I'll share some of those we've already received, plus any posted in the chat room. I'll then invite those in the sanctuary to share. Please know that all ongoing prayer requests remain each week in our prayer email. God, hear our healing prayers for Jennifer, who's struggling with postpartum cardiomyopathy, Colleen, who's being treated for cancer, Marion, who had a stroke last weekend, Emily's Aunt Ginger, who's being treated for advanced ovarian cancer, and all who are dealing with long-term health concerns and diagnoses. God, hear our prayers for a safe, free, and fair election. For Stephanie's sister Lucinda, who's having a rough time. Nancy's friend Laird and his partner Susan as he enters hospice. All those impacted by hurricanes Helene and Milton. All those in Palestine, Israel, Lebanon, Ukraine, Sudan, Haiti, and anywhere there is violence, who are suffering and in harm's way. All those experiencing homelessness, those suffering from the climate crisis, all victims of gun violence, and anyone, anywhere, who is sick or grieving or in need. If you have a concern you'd like to share, please raise your hand and Lee will bring you the microphone so those online can hear. Our service is recorded, and so if you would prefer not to speak into the microphone, just let Lee know that.
I just want to lift up, many folks know I'm Cuban American, and Cuba's been going through a really tough time economically the last many years, but particularly this year. And a couple days ago, the power grid in Cuba collapsed completely, no power on the island. And it's a really, really serious situation for the people of Cuba, and made more complicated because Cuban government doesn't allow humanitarian aid in at the moment. So just praying for the island.
Thank you so much for bringing that up, Christina. Other prayers, other concerns? All right, we'll move. Oh, yes, Catherine.
I wondered whether this was a celebration or a concern, but in the middle of the night, a couple of nights ago, I got 45 more addresses for postcards, get out the vote postcards, and I've done 20, and I think of it as election magic with, not a lot of faith in that. But I realized as I was listening that really they're also prayers. We sent 1,200 prayers out to Georgia, Pennsylvania, and North Carolina, I think. And so these 45 are going to Alabama. If anybody would like to do 20, I have them with me. John? Okay, great. Thank you. Or if you want to share them with John, let us both know. And thank you, Lee, for doing my job.
Thank you, Catherine. These are nonpartisan postcards through the Center for Common Ground being sent to mostly communities of color, low vote areas of the country, primarily in swing states. All right, joys. God, we give thanks for this glorious weather. Oh, I'm sorry. Before I give thanks for the glorious weather. Okay, there's a private concern. I'm sorry. God, we give thanks for this glorious weather and the chance to enjoy it with friends and family. For Nick's 30th birthday that he celebrated on a Special Olympics leadership cruise this past week. and for the break that I got while Nick was on said cruise. And all those who devote their lives to creating peace, joy, and justice in this world. Other joys. Melissa.
So this is two simple joys. One is there is a election drop box in the Guy Mason parking lot. And on my way to church this morning, 2 different people approached me and asked me if I knew where to find it. And I was able to get them there because I voted on Monday. But the other simple joy is for the return of fall festivals at schools. While all this is going on, and we're all very concerned about the next 17 days, yesterday was the Washington Latin Fall Festival, and it was a great success thanks to John's efforts and a lot of volunteers. But I bring it up because there were also free vaccines for flu and COVID available to the entire community, walk-up, school, and otherwise. And today is Stoddart's Fall Festival. So this is kind of the first return to sort of post-COVID normal for these kinds of events, and it's a real joy. Thanks.
Thank you, Melissa. That's wonderful. Alan.
Please pardon my left-handed joy, which some may translate as a concern, but it truly is a joy. I want to celebrate Reverend Graylin Hagler, who's the pastor emeritus of our sister congregation in Plymouth Congregational UCC on North Capitol Street, for his courageous op-ed entitled, "I Don't Want to Hear About Your Holocaust Any Longer." If you want to read it, just go to Google and type in Hagler and "I don't want to hear about your Holocaust," and it will come right up. Basically, it says, in short, Israel is carrying out a Holocaust in Gaza and West Bank. And they are spreading their pogrom into Lebanon, Iran, and Syria. I think it takes a lot of guts to write something like that as a minister, and I celebrate him.
Thank you, Alan. Reverend Hagler has worked for many years for Palestinian rights, and I will say that he also has many Jewish friends, and his intention is not at all anti-Semitic. I think it's important to add that. Other joys. John.
Leah's getting her steps in. That's one joy. Just a very innocent joy. Yesterday, Magda and I attended a softball game of one of her besties, and it was just a beautiful day, screaming girls all over the place, and her bestie really dug out a hard grounder at second and threw the person out at first. I feel bad for that person, but anyway, it was just super fun and a beautiful day, and the fall is here.
Thank you, John. Any other joys?
I have one.
Yes, Lee.
Actually, it's fun. I discovered this morning who is enjoying my pumpkin. It is a squirrel who has eaten one of my pumpkins.
Lee, I'm so glad you said that. I am on my 5th pumpkin, and they're big ones from Costco, okay? And it's not just the squirrels. As some of you know, I have to take my aging dog out to potty in the middle of the night, and I have startled some very large bucks who are really enjoying their version of pumpkin pie.
Well, they're really out. My lovely 21-year-old neighbor across the street, her birthday's on Halloween, and so she goes to the pumpkin patch and picks pumpkins, and her house is decorated. Every single one of them has had something eaten out of it. I got a picture this morning, which I'm going to send to the grandkids and the great-grands, of the squirrel down inside eating the seeds and everything. It's really fun.
As a result of the drought, they don't have
acorns,
what they need, and so, put out those pumpkins.
Yeah.
Okay, there you go. There you go. Let us pray. Loving God, listen to the prayers of your people. Comfort and nourish us in both our joys and our concerns, spoken or unspoken, and hold us tenderly as we face the many different experiences that life and being human can bring. Holy and gracious Spirit, we are grateful for your presence as we move into this new week, a time that will bring forth its own sorrows and joys. Remind us to hold one another in love and prayer, reaching out as we are able, to lend a hand, offer support, or share in celebration. We give thanks for the blessing of this congregation in our lives and pray that we might be a blessing to others in return. In your compassionate name, amen. I invite you to hold all of these joys and concerns and any others in your heart as Dan plays Processional on Westminster Abbey. Thank you, Dan. This is the time in our service when we receive the offering in grateful appreciation for the life and work of this beloved community. To support the ongoing work of our congregation, I invite you to give in person, via mail, or online as you are able. If you're in the sanctuary, you may contribute as the offering plate is passed, or take out your phone and scan the QR code on the back of your worship bulletin. If you've already donated, I invite you to take one of the offering cards in the pew racks and put it in the plate as a symbol of your giving. For those on Zoom, the link to our donate page is in the chat room. This morning, as Lisa said, we invite you to contribute as well to the UCC's annual Neighbors in Need collection. This year's donations will support mental health justice in communities across the United States. To make a contribution, you can either go to the donate page and choose Neighbors in Need, or write a check to our church with Neighbors in Need in the memo line. I offer you many thanks for all your gifts of money, time, energy, and spirit. Please remain standing as you are able for our closing hymn, Commission and Sung Benediction.
Hello, Richard.
Hello.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
And I think we can hear you.
Okay, that's great.
So now the only question then is, can you show your slide here? Okay. So we'd come into here, and then we would choose
I guess that one.
that.
Yeah.
All righty.
Yep, there they are.
All right, so I'm going to stop sharing for the moment. Yeah. All right. This might actually work. All righty. So I'm going to go finish off the service stuff.
If we're going to do that, we tell them what happened after the riot. What a force the good. If you can share your operating and I think Emily's going to get us started. Hello, Richard. Good to see you. Okay, everyone, thank you. Thanks so much for coming. And just to let you know how this all came about, starting in the summer, there was a exhibit and program at Cleveland Park Library called Undesigned the Red Line, which got into the history of housing discrimination in DC, particularly in Ward 3. And if you recall, a bunch of us got a little tour of that exhibit after worship over the summer. But I think it was one of the first programs I went to, and this will be really shocking to you. I showed up late. Bob was presenting, and suddenly, while I'm like looking for a seat, I see like Cleveland Park, picture of Cleveland Park Church, and he was giving an example of the racially restricted covenants in the area. And we thought we hadn't had one. We knew it was common. So I got his email and he shared the specifics, which was really interesting, and then so kindly agreed to present. So just one thing about Bob, he told me, he let me know that he got interested in Cleveland Park history when he was president of the Cleveland Park Club, and then went on to found a nonprofit preservation organization called Cleveland Park Club Foundation. And I'm not going to talk anymore.
Sure, thank you.
Oh, wait, one minute, sorry, one minute. We're going to have a Q&A at the end, so if you could just hold your questions. Oh, that's Bob.
Thank you, appreciate it.
All right, it's harder to check out, if you get feedback, whether you can hear me talking. And how we can, what we can do to make the environment more viewing friendly. Yeah, so Bob, I don't know if you heard that, but the acoustics in here are challenging, so you can really
I will
project.
project. Awesome. Thank you for having me. Yeah, so this is a story that started, as Emily mentioned. I was president of the Cleveland Park Club, and we had a very ambitious project to redesign the pool and the pool deck, and it was going to require a bit of fundraising. And so what I thought would be interesting is to, in that pitch to raise money, go back and look at some of the history of the club, which actually is pretty rich. As I was going through and trying to get pictures of people who had founded the club and that sort of thing, I used the newspaper archives at the library, which is a great online resource if you ever want to go back down the sort of memory machine of anywhere. I noticed some things about the neighborhood that I found striking that I'm going to go through in some of these slides, but that was sort of the origin of my history investigation into the neighborhood. Familiar with sort of the told history of the neighborhood. When the neighborhood was designated a historic district in the late 80s, there's a really good comprehensive write-up of not just the architectural styles, but sort of like the people involved and that sort of thing. And one of the things that stood out that I want to show this first, because I think it will mention it again at the end. But John Sherman and his wife Ella Sherman were the founders of the Cleveland Park Company, which were the initial developers of our neighborhood. There was actually, I think, at least 3 different developers who had parts in putting pieces of the neighborhood together. But in the nomination, which is basically the recitation of the history of the neighborhood, Sherman is mentioned as an enlightened and benevolent real estate developer. And so as we go through sort of the history of exclusion in the early parts of our neighborhood, I think we come to question that enlightened and benevolent descriptor. I mean, I think this was meant to talk about how there was community stables and there was a lodge where you could wait for the streetcar and those sort of like community amenities that was referring to, but it takes on a different picture when we dig into things.
Wait for the end of the question.
Yeah.
we're gonna hold questions to,
At its time, it was marketed as a very upscale new neighborhood with artistic homes. It was called the Queen of the Washington suburbs. But the history of exclusion, which I'll get into in a minute, was not forefront in a lot of the Cleveland Park marketing materials initially. But that changed. So as I mentioned, the Cleveland Park Company was the original developer, which started up around Newark and 36th Street, and then moved down to Lower Macomb Street and Newark Street and Highland in that area. Connecticut Avenue Highlands was the second major development in the area, and that was basically from Ordway north along Connecticut Avenue. And here just some advertisements talking about, so for Cleveland Park, homes have been restricted to artistic homes. Woodley Park, an advertisement, the most restricted neighborhood in Washington. Connecticut Avenue Highlands, we see this restricted neighborhood. So I started seeing these things, and it sort of egged me on to look deeper into what all this meant. And so I started looking for the term. And so just some examples that came from newspaper ads in the real estate section back in the early 1900s. So persons who are surrounded by inferior houses and undesirable neighbors can appreciate in a very forcible manner the importance of our restriction clause. Persons owning fine homes and having shanties built in their immediate neighborhoods, to say nothing of the undesirable persons who frequently occupy them, can appreciate the force of our building restriction clause. So it wasn't just the architecture that was being restricted, it was who you had to live near was being restricted. I then was turned on to a great project called Mapping Segregation DC. Sarah Schoenfeld and Mara Charaski are from Prologue DC, and they've put together this site, which is, I've since learned, trying to track the restricted deeds throughout DC. And so having heard about it, I went to our neighborhood, and this is probably now 4 or 5 years ago, and was looking, and really there were only a handful of homes that were on the map. And I'm like, all right, well, let's go Cleveland Park, pretty good. It turned out actually not to be the case. They hadn't gotten to Cleveland Park yet, and we're kind of looking for volunteers to do that work. And so I went up and down my street to start. I live on Macomb Street. And so one of the things you see in many of the deeds, the earliest deeds from like the early 1900s, all the way up to about the late teens, were restrictions based on price. And so you had, imagine this place without any homes. It was just lots that were sketched out, and you could, buy a lot and build a home, or have the Cleveland Park Company build a home for you. And the restriction was that you couldn't erect a house that cost less than, in this case, this house on the corner of Macomb and Ross Place, $4,000. That's just the building cost of the home. In some cases, it was $5,000. In some cases, it was a little higher. In some cases, it was a little lower. But basically establishing a floor, which, this was sort of the clause that the advertisements were referring to, was to make sure that, you weren't living next to shanties, that these would be high quality homes that only a certain level of consumer could afford to buy at that time. As the years progressed, getting into the late teens and early 20s, you started seeing specific racial restrictive covenants. And so here's a house on Macomb Street that, says that the lot shall never be rented, leased, sold, or transferred or conveyed to any Negro or colored person or any person of Negro extraction. And so very specific racial restriction clause. And so this, once I found one, I had to keep looking everywhere. And so I kept looking, and I was going up and down the streets literally, and I got to Ordway Street, used to be called Omaha Street, and I came across this deed, which absolutely blew my socks off, because the properties, so where are we? Okay, so if you go down 34th Street to Ordway and make a left, that first row of which are now, I think, attached or semi-detached homes, all to the east of the IM Pay House. So this is the properties that we're talking about.
West, don't you?
West, yes. No, east of the IM Pay House, because the IM Pay House is right here. And so these lots would be east of that. So there was a number of restrictions on these properties. There shall be a house built that costs no less than $3,500, nor shall said real estate or any part thereof be sold or leased to persons of African descent. So consistent with some of the other racial deeds, I think the interesting thing here is that the owners of the property was the church, the Cleveland Park Congregational Church, and they were selling this land to a buyer, and this was in 1922. And there was a whole resolution from the board of the church authorizing the sale of this property, but the racial restriction. Now, did the church put the racial restriction on there? Don't know. Did it start with the developer who subdivided that area, which would be the third development in the area, which was called the Richmond Park development. And that is where most of the racial restrictive covenants we found in the neighborhood existed. It was the third and latest. Racial covenants, I think, were probably more prominent in the 20s and late teens, not in the early 1900s. And so I went literally up and down the street looking at the deeds. You can look up deeds online. The online database goes back to 1921. So if they existed before then and didn't show up in a later deed, it's going to require a lot more legwork and actually going to the archive itself and looking up the paper records. But everywhere you see a blue dot is where a racially restrictive covenant was in our neighborhood. And so this was largely the Richmond Park development. Cleveland Park Highlands is over here, and this was much earlier in like the early 1900s, and the restrictions that were on most of these properties were the price restrictions. And then this was sort of the Cleveland Park Company. These houses on Macomb Street where the racial restricted deeds were houses built by Harry Kite in the early 1920s. So sort of more consistent with when these developments were.
Can you orient this? Where
Yeah, so yeah, we are here just off screen. So this is Macomb Street, Newark Street, Ordway Street, Porter, Quebec, Rodman. Wisconsin's over here, Connecticut's over here. So quite a few that we found. And in talking with the folks at Mapping Segregation DC, Sarah and Mara, they believe that it's probably all of these houses originally, and it was likely the developer who put these restrictions in place, and that just transferred with everyone's deed going forward until they were, deemed to be unenforceable and then finally illegal. The Miller brothers grew up on Highland Place. They were one of the founders of the Cleveland Park Club, and they were part of a real estate family and became developers in their own right. Developed a lot of houses in Cleveland Park, and then went on to develop whole neighborhoods.
Also built the church that you're in lately.
Okay, there we go.
In Spring Valley, but I'll get to that when we have it.
Yep, and so this was to that point. They built Spring Valley, they built Wesley Heights, and they ensured that there were pretty extensive restrictive covenants in their deeds, not only excluding folks of African descent, but the Semitic race or blood, Jews, Hebrews, Armenians, Persians, Syrians. So they were quite comprehensive in who they didn't want to live near. And even the apartment buildings, this was the Kennedy Warren, which was built in the early 1920s, maintain the highest standards in the selection of tenants who will aid in maintaining the character of the property. So every which way you looked, there were sort of restrictions on who could live in the neighborhood. And it was very effective. I went through the 1940 census, and you can go through house by house, literally up and down the blocks, who lives there. There was not one Black homeowner in Cleveland Park in the 1940 census. There were residents who lived here who were enumerated in the census. They were all servants. They were all domestics living in the household of a white family. There were no renters who were living in any of our apartment buildings who were Black, except for those whose resident was due to their employment by the apartment building. So maid, janitor, in the larger buildings, you had elevator operators and that sort of thing, but no one who was there, living independently in their own right. And just to wrap up, this is some data I pulled together, and this is basically all of Ward 3, but Cleveland Park does not distinguish itself, so I didn't go back and just look at our census tract. But from the 1930s to the 1970s and 80s, DC actually experienced an explosion in Black population. So through the war years and after, DC went from about 27% population being Black all the way up to a high of 71% in the 1970 census, during which time the Black population of Ward 3 actually was very small, but went down. So as Black population was expanding throughout the city, Black population here was contracting. It has started going back up again as of the 2020 census, but still pretty small. So that's sort of my wrap up of the neighborhood and its history. And yeah.
No, that actually, sorry. Emily and I agreed that we're gonna allow both presenters because Richard really does sort of pair and follow right on Bob's. Bob, thank you so much.
Yeah, you're very welcome.
Questions and discussion, promise. So Richard, I'm assuming you were able to hear Bob.
Say again?
I'm assuming you were able to hear Bob.
Oh, yes.
Wonderful. Okay, so you're going to follow on now, and for everybody, many of you know Richard Bombach, some of you don't. Richard and his wife Susan have been members of our congregation for decades, and Richard is sort of known as our very own church historian. He put together our 90th and contributed to our 100th anniversary sort of little history booklets, and when we found out this information from Bob a few months ago, we went to Richard and said, hey, gosh, do you know anything about this? And Richard is going to tell us what he does know. And I should also add that we are so happy to see you, Richard. We hope to bring you online, more often going forward, especially, you and Susan are moving to West Virginia next month, and we're going to miss you.
Well, we're going to miss you guys too. Sorry, we don't get down to church very much, but recently, but we've gotten old. It happens to everybody if you wait long enough. Okay. Yeah, this business of restrictive covenants is a rather interesting one. And there is a book which has been recommended, and I've read it, called Chocolate City. I believe there are several copies at the church. And if you want to understand the nature of racial relations through the history of Washington, D.C., that's the book to read. It's really quite interesting. And one of the things that they pointed out in that book, which I found very interesting, is that restrictive covenants actually proliferated after 1917, that up until then, it had been possible for places to actually zone for racial occupation and things like that. But a Supreme Court decision in 1917 prohibited state and local governments from mandating segregation through zoning and zoning ordinances. But it did not address the exclusive agreements used by private individuals. And that's where the restrictive clauses in deeds and things like that started, because that was a contract from an individual to another. And that was still legal after 1917. And so that's when the restrictive covenants started to be put into property documents. And that happened, as we've just heard, in a very impressive presentation for all of Cleveland Park. And that extended out through almost all of Northwest Washington, and it lasted a remarkably long time. I have recently, in getting ready to make the move that Susan and I are going to make, I've been getting rid of old documents that have been left behind. We have had them in storage and things like that. And I ran across the property deed for my parents' house at 6223 30th Street, which is near Rock Creek Park and out very close to the Maryland line in Chevy Chase. And lo and behold, there was a restrictive covenant again about African Americans could not purchase that property. Now, that's the deed that my folks got when we moved to Washington in 1947. So those were active as late as that. And I just found that a very interesting thing. Anyway, for this for the church, and we've already heard about these lots on Ordway Street, and it's rather interesting. The property, what I've done for this little discussion is try to track down when this church has leased or bought property, land or buildings. And it turns out that the 1917 date for starting many of these restrictive covenants is rather interesting, because it happens to be that it was in 1917 or 18, probably November of 1917, that the development of Cleveland Park Church was started, and a wooden chapel, which the Church Development Committee of the Congregational Church had ordered for us, arrived and was dumped on this vacant lot at 34th and Lowell Street. And that vacant lot belonged to Woodward and Lothrop's. But there were two lots next to it that a man named Fox also owned. And the church rented or leased those lots, or at least the one from that Woody's owned, so that it could build the little wooden chapel that started our church on it. And that was in November of 1917. Our first church service was in March of 1918. The 5 lots that were mentioned in the talk before mine, there were 5 lots that the church actually purchased in January of 1919 for $7,500. And they purchased those lots because that's where they thought they would actually build a permanent church. 4 of the lots were paid for on March 4th, 1918, and the 5th in May of 1918. They decided somewhat later that, in fact, they would keep the church at 34th and Lowell, And so they decided to purchase the corner lot plus a lot or two going up Lowell Street. And that was done in May of 1921. Mr. Cox, who owned the lots next to the Woody's lot, raised the price because it was going to be something where they would not have a resale of the property for a long time. And the church actually paid for 2 lots, $7,131. So these are transactions in which the restrictive covenants actually were part of the system. Going on into the future, it turns out that we owned a parsonage, which we purchased in 1944. And that was at 3218 34th Street. And that had a restrictive covenant actually attached to it. And then that was sold in 1964. And the church, or the house right behind the church at 3110 34th Street was something the church actually purchased at 3/4 or 2/3 of the listed price. So it was a bargain. I don't know when that house was sold, if it ever has been. But those are the business transactions that our church actually did, which had restrictive covenants associated with them. The idea of restricted covenants, of course, today is shocking, and they aren't permitted, of course. But I think it's important to realize a little bit of history, and that'll be what concludes my comments. 100 years ago is 1924, a century since this sort of thing actually was being done. Maryland and the District of Columbia had legal slavery only 52 years earlier than that. Wow. Because the Emancipation Proclamation applied only to the areas that were in rebellion against the United States. It wasn't until the Constitution was amended that slavery was not permitted in the non-rebellious states. So you have to put this sort of thing into history, and I don't think that the people who were dealing with this property for the church were actually particularly interested in a racially prejudiced sense, other than just they were part of the society of their time. And I do think that we need to be understanding of that, though I'm certainly glad that things have changed. So that concludes my comments, but we, as part of this area of Washington, D.C., were part of that history with those restrictive covenants. Thank you.
Thank you, Richard. And so before we open it up for questions and discussion, I just wonder if you or Bob have any questions or comments for each other's presentation.
No, I think actually I've had a copy of Bob's presentation for a number of months, and it's very impressive. And I don't have any particular questions. As I say, I would try to track down the actual case that was the 1917 Supreme Court decision, and was not able to find that. That's the one thing that he might want to look into as well. That's all.
For sure. I don't have any questions, but it's a fascinating history. And I didn't realize all of the other properties that were associated also had restrictions. No, I was just saying, I found the history of the church's property, more broadly, and that there were others that had restrictive covenants, associated with them, very fascinating. So thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you both so much. And so let's open it up to questions. And let's try to keep it more to questions than to statements. Although if you have information you do want to share, that's fine, but let's keep that part of things shorter, and take advantage of the fact that we have these two presenters here. So Alan, I think you wanted to go
It's a
first.
short story, but it's a true story about the day that William Miller's grandson came to visit our church. I was out.
Excuse me, maybe you should speak closer to the economy.
I was outside
Yeah,
the
so
church.
Richard came here.
Can you hear me, Richard?
Yes, I can hear you now.
I was outside the church sweeping the gutter on a Saturday morning with the Building and Grounds Committee, and this middle-aged couple came with their kids, and they wanted to come in the church to see it. And I said, the church is closed on Saturday, but you're welcome to come on Sunday. He told me he was the grandson of William Miller, and he wanted to see what the inside of the church looked like.
Wow.
But he would not come and visit us on Sunday because he was a Mormon. Or the grandfather was a Mormon, but they bragged. They didn't just have racial covenants. They bragged about them. I've read their promotional literature for Spring Valley from the 30s. They were bragging about keeping Jews and blacks out. This was a selling point for them. And he built several houses in this neighborhood as well.
Yeah.
You know that, Richard, right?
Yes, sad but true.
He built houses on your street.
Did he build some houses on your street? Alan was asking, Richard.
Say again.
Alan wanted to know if he built some houses on your street, the street there.
On my street, clear out in the 30th Street. I really don't know the answer to that question.
Cleveland Park, he built some houses.
But he built them down here, yes, in Cleveland Park.
Richard's family didn't live in Cleveland Park.
But they did live there now. Don't they live here now?
No, they live in Leisure World.
Oh, I thought you were over by Rose Park.
No.
Oh no, we
With Frost.
my house or my parents' house was way out near the DC line.
Christina.
First of all, thank you for this. This was really interesting. I was just wondering, is there anything, I suppose this question is more for Richard, but either of you all can comment. Is there any evidence of like after the church staff or like members discussing this post, like before we all went to the undesigned red line thing, Emily and I were there together and we're like, oh, didn't know about this. Like, is there any evidence of the church having conversations about this in, I'm thinking 50s, 60s, 70s?
No.
I guess, Lee, I could have asked you.
I would suspect not, since it was never included in any of our history.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah.
No, I know in looking at the history and reading the documents back through time, I've never seen any mentions of this sort of thing. It's all something that
Look at the deed.
just in legal documents.
When you buy a house, generally, do you read the deed?
Yeah. It's interesting. Thanks.
Okay, somebody's got to
Looks like we have a couple more.
choose.
Emily.
I guess I have Bob or Richard, but I have just a more specific question about the deeds, because Bob, you mentioned the restrictive covenant was maybe put in by the developer, but once you buy a property with a deed, you still have to draft a new deed when you sell it. I'm just right. I mean, it doesn't like automatically carry over.
I think that's true. I mean, having bought and sold a few properties, I know I probably didn't play any role in the writing up of the deed. And one of the things that's frustrating as you go through the deed records, there's typically a catch-all phrase that this is subject to any of the covenants of record. And so it may not be in that particular sale or transaction, but is incumbent upon like the title person to go back and look at all the different deeds that go back into, you know, to the origins that put you on the hook for whatever the restrictions were going back in time as well.
It's not a new deed every time you buy.
Okay.
But no, and in fact, once you get past a certain point, it's like a form. And that catch-all phrase sort of, you know, puts you on the hook for everything that's happened beforehand, and it's kind of up to you to go back and do that title search.
Or would someone have the option to remove something that was put on previous?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's possible, and from what I've heard, it's difficult to do, and there's, I think, a pretty vigorous debate right now in both the history community, but also the social justice community of like how that happens and should it happen?
Right, because you don't really want to erase the history.
Oh, yeah, no, that's not, I meant at the time,
Oh, yeah, I mean, I think, yeah, you probably could. I'm not an expert in that.
I think there's a homeowner over here who's had his hand up.
David.
Ordway Street.
Okay, David and then Carol.
I'd just like to ask if you know when and why and how these covenants were ended.
Yes.
Well, they're sort of as a blanket, in 1948, there was a Supreme Court decision that made racially restrictive covenants unenforceable, but not illegal. And then it was, I think, 1968 where the Supreme Court ruled that they would in fact be illegal and would have no power of law.
But some houses in the neighborhood still might have them in there, they're just not legal.
Right, that's right.
One of the issues in politics in the 1950s and 60s that I heard was where did members of Congress and vice presidents live? And I think it was said that Richard Nixon and Lyndon Johnson lived in Spring Valley.
George H. Bush lived
And then the question is, where did they go to send their kids to school? Sidwell or NCS or Alice Steele? The two congressmen's kids in my class at Alice Steele in 1958 were Beverly Whitten of Mississippi and Royston Gathings of Arkansas. If you know, you could rely on being the neighborhood being suitable for Southern congressmen.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense.
And now they wouldn't do that. You know, people avoid like the plague DC public schools unless you have just the right neighborhood.
Yep, I think that's right.
Yes.
I'm just curious with the pricing, what is that in today's, I just know that the house I grew up in was built in 1970 and it cost $22,000 to build. So I mean, when you're talking about like a $35,000 house, what is that in today's dollars?
I'm not sure what it is in today's dollars. But I mean, the consumer price index, I think there's a calculator online, you can plug those.
He's calculating.
Okay.
Going to Mr. Google.
But houses at the,
But it's 35,000 in what was the year?
it was 3,500
3,500.
for the cost of building the house. So not the land, not the sale price of the house, but the actual building cost. In some cases, it was $5,000. I know like the house where the Cleveland Park Club exists today, when that was originally sold, I think it sold for around $5,000. That was the total sale price, and that was 1904. And so it's you know, not everyone could afford that. It was a price that was high enough that it would be, you know, the type of people who lived in the neighborhood in the beginning there were some congressmen, but there were also journalists. The National Bureau of Standards was up the street, so you had a lot of engineers and scientists who live here. So it's sort of like upper middle class.
Well, and they intentionally, as you showed us, they intentionally advertised it that way. Like
Yeah.
these are priced at a price that will keep out undesirable.
That was the intent. That's why it's there.
Yeah.
$3,500 in 1904 would be worth $120,000 now.
That's just
Yeah,
the price.
that's the building cost of the house,
Yeah, just the
not the land. Yeah. Yep.
Never mind how, yeah.
Yeah, I have a question that is, I'm actually asking on behalf of Holly, who's teaching yoga this morning. But I was talking to her about the presentation, and we were wondering whether there were any other churches in DC or the area who have encountered this in their history? And if so, how are they addressing or dealing with it?
I know that there's been some discussion in the Episcopal Diocese of Maryland. I don't know what they did with it, but I know it has been a discussion there.
Yeah, I wouldn't have an answer. I think a good source would be the two women I mentioned from Prologue DC, Sarah Schoenfeld and Mara Charaski. They have a real sort of deep knowledge of what's going on sort of district-wide and might have some answers to that. I don't.
Can someone write the name down? I don't have a, or how do you spell
I was
it?
just gonna say there's also something with St. Columbia, but I can't
St.
remember
Columbus.
exactly. Oh, St. Columbia. I can't remember exactly what it was in their history. Yeah.
Yeah, St. Columba's, they had, I learned this through the Undesign the Red Line project. There were two Episcopal parishes, St. Columba's, and I think the other one was St. George's. St. George's was an African-American church, and I think, don't know that all that what happened, but basically St. Columba's absorbed St. George's real estate and assets. And they had to go find another church somewhere. And I think they're going through a process of sort of reconciling that history.
I just had a question to build off of that. And Bob, you're maybe a neutral party, as you might say, you're not a member of this church. So I'm wondering what you think we should do with this information. What is the responsible thing to do with this information?
I mean, I think all of the conversations around this topic, and so would include, for a church who's found this, I mean, I think it's just important for people to know the history. I think that is the most important thing, is to like recognize it. And then I think, as a congregation, you guys have been extremely active in sort of like promoting equity and that sort of thing. So I think that box is checked, but I think the history itself, I think, is something that, parishioners should know. And
Maybe we could have a plaque.
maybe.
I do just want to note that we are planning in January or maybe sometime in the new year to have a follow-up coffee hour conversation of sort of like just addressing that
Yes,
question.
I was curious.
No. I just wanted to like placeholder, put it in your minds. What do we do with this information?
Yeah, I'll just follow up and say, I think it was 5 years ago that we did the racial justice audit. And we didn't know this information at the time, or we would have incorporated that. But when we found out about it, we said, well, we need to have a session where we tell people and make sure everyone understands. And then, as Emily said, our plan is to have a follow-up conversation next year, but we wanted to focus more on an information sharing thing. And it's sort of an outgrowth of the racial justice team. But anyone who's interested in this topic should let us know and get involved.
Yeah, and in the meanwhile, if people do have ideas or knowledge of other churches who are engaged at all in sort of a question of, I'll use the term reparations.
Sure.
We would like to know so that we can reach out and get information from those churches. My understanding is that the cathedral has a group that is doing some work on that, obviously St. Columba's. And then I think, Emily, you just wrote down a Prologue people, we can connect with them. But yeah, sorry. Oh, thank you.
A quick Google search suggests that Paul's Church has talked about this a lot because of some prominent churches there having covenants on their property.
Interesting. Okay, Mary Jane and then Jane.
I apologize because I think this isn't a question, it's a statement, but I'm reminded my husband's family came from Phoenix City, Alabama, which is just on the river across from Columbus, Georgia, where there's a huge army base, and they were landowners there, and we were in Phoenix City trying to find records of the family. We went to the courthouse and they said, oh, go look in our archives. And in the back in stacks were boxes and books. And in the corner was a huge pile. And I said, what's that? And, oh, those are the poll tax records. We're going to throw them all out. And I remember thinking, wow, that's a terrible thing you're doing, a crime against history.
Yeah.
Because
wow,
it's just wrong.
Right, you're erasing your participation.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Wow.
Sorry for my.
Yeah, no, thank you. Jane, you had your hand up.
I'm just so impressed by all of this.
Yeah.
I didn't know what to expect. In past years, meetings like this. Hacking. And I've just been listening to this. And this just represents, we have a long way to go. But progress is being made, and a lot of it is due to neighbors like you who have dug into the research. So thank you.
Thank you.
No, thank you for your research. It's an interesting subject, I think.
Yeah, thank you.
Would it be possible for us to get your PowerPoint slides to share with folks who weren't able to be here this morning, or
Yep.
I don't want to like take your property, but
No,
if that's something
I
you're willing
will,
to share.
yeah, they may exist on this laptop, but I will email
Okay.
Emily,
Awesome.
a copy of them
Great,
as
thank
well.
you.
And I'll point out a couple of other things, because I think, the conversation of when these things happened and when they became unenforceable and uninteresting, I think sort of a few things that I found additionally beyond sort of the property deeds, was that there was a turning point in the neighborhood that was probably around 1962, the early 1960s, where you had an old guard in this neighborhood that were very much cognizant of the restrictions and supportive of them. And then new people who were moving in that were very much against it. And two examples of that. So the Cleveland Park Citizens Association officially removed their restriction of colored people being able to join the organization in, I think, 1962. And then one of the instances I dug up at the Cleveland Park Club was a family of diplomats invited their friends who were in town from Ghana to go to the pool. And you can imagine that there were some, not emails, because they didn't exist back then, but strongly worded letters that flew around. And there were folks who said, we have an unwritten rule about who can attend this club, and because it wasn't written. But by I think that was 62 as well. And I think 1964, all of those people who were like wanting to foment the change were now the board members of the Cleveland Park Club. So that was sort of like the tipping point of the neighborhood.
Follow-up question to that, like you mentioned in your slides that the Black population in DC was like skyrocketing in the 70s and decreasing here. So it just seems to me like there must have been, sure, they don't have racially restricted covenants, but then there's like redneck lining or zoning. And I wonder if you have any.
Yeah, no, I think it was, the restrictions were certainly multi-layered. It was not just covenants that kept people out of it. So there was the economic, restriction. If you just make something cost a certain amount, then you've excluded a class of people who can't participate in that. Yeah, I mean, the redlining, I think the Undesign the Redline project got into that pretty well. And it was, how the government basically, defined categories of risk, and the definitions of the categories were explicitly based on race. Undesirable and high risk and infiltration of Negroes into a neighborhood would downgrade your mortgage risk rating. And it was the home loan agency of the federal government that were drawing those maps and writing those sort of definitions. That doesn't get into what the real estate industry practiced in a very overt, and then I think, since then, less overt, who they would show houses to, and, what houses particular people would not be shown. And that played a part of it.
That's human nature. Instead of being overt, you wear a mask or a veil. And real estate and funeral homes are great for that,
Yeah,
So
no.
you learn to read the subdialect to say what they're really talking about.
Yeah, there was a time when it was overt. It was part of the real estate board of ethics. You would not show a Black family looking for a home anything in a white neighborhood. That was part of their code of ethics.
Like over economic piece, you just started getting into this a little bit, like some of it is economic too.
and you and I were chatting about this before, 'cause I live in a co-op on Porter Street, and it's now not legal to build those co-ops. When was that put in place? When was that like made not legal to have?
So that was in the early so the first zoning code in DC was 1920, and it was very basic. It was like residential, commercial, industrial.
Yeah.
That was it.
Yeah.
And so during that time, you had a number of multifamily buildings that were built not just on the corridors, but on some of the side streets.
Yeah.
So you got your co-ops on Porter, in addition to a bunch of other apartment buildings along that strip. Macomb Street has the apartment building across from Wiss. Rodman has a apartment building up the street from Connecticut. Those were all built in the early 1920s. I found some newspaper articles about the fight to introduce a restricted zoning, so you had just basically residential, which was anything, single family home, apartment building, whatever. And they wanted to create areas where apartment buildings would not be allowed. So that was the early 1920s when that was put into place.
So like right after all of those.
Right after all those were built.
Okay, yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah. And it was definitely around who you didn't want to live with.
Reaction to it.
And the builders were like, but where are the working class, the government clerks and everyone gonna live? That was their pushback, which they lost.
Yeah.
Gary.
There are other factors in play, because I'm not a member of this congregation, but when I come here, the racial
Diversity.
basis look pretty much like it did,
Yeah.
I suppose, back in the 20s. And so there's other factors.
Well, nobody's living here. If people don't live here, if other races don't live in the neighborhood, they're not gonna come.
Well,
It's
that's
called the
not
most-
really true.
it's the
We
most
have people from
segregated
India
hour of
living
the week.
On Ordway Street, and I've seen people they look Chinese or something.
Well, they don't happen to be Congregationalists.
Well, it's actually, it's both of those reasons. So one is that in fact, we do not live in a very diverse area of the city. And in fact, our city for the most part is quite segregated into different neighborhoods. So that is one thing. The other reason is that because we're in a metropolitan area, we have a large number of churches of every denomination. And because historically, most of those denominations had Black versions and white versions of their congregations, that is still true. And in DC, we have many originally Black congregational churches, now Black UCC churches, and originally white congregational churches, now UCC churches. And so it is, because people have options, and again, because of the racially segregated neighborhoods, it is much harder than one would hope to actually create an integrated congregation. So I've always seen our role as it is less important that we sort of, strive to make our congregation more diverse and then pat ourselves on the back, like, look at, our diversity. And more important for us as a white congregation to do what we need to do to educate ourselves, to make reparations, to, make our city as a whole more just.
You better preach, Al. Yes.
Jane.
At one time, it looked like we were going to be working more with people's congregation.
Right.
And, things just move on. But I enjoyed very much. We had sessions on TV, and like a Black member, it was there, the Black church had organized it. And I and Trish, we were the two new people.
Right.
And their efforts, without being condescending, to encourage each of us to take part in the discussion was quite touching. And I thought, I hope white churches are doing this.
Yeah. Yeah, and I agree. We need to, I think it's important that we do more of that.
And just
Absolutely.
can I just plug that, the conference has these justice issues organized, and for DC it's housing. And so, someone from People's Church is the chair of that group, and they meet every other Tuesday, and there's no one, they've been wanting someone from Cleveland Park to participate, and we haven't had anyone participate in a couple of years. So if you're interested, let me know, or Vivian, yeah, Vivian's always, every time she sees me, she mentions she wishes someone from Cleveland Park Church. So a lot of it's about showing up, and we have to get out of Ward 3.
Yeah, likewise, Reverend William Young in Covenant Baptist UCC, yes, that is Covenant Baptist UCC, a Baptist congregation that joined the UCC because we are the United Church of Christ, in Anacostia, is doing a lot of work, and Emily's been to a church service there that because of focusing on the Palestinian issues, and they, are really wanting to host things and have other, congregations cross the river and join them for things. So, I can put more information out about that as well.
One of the challenges that I've been in the UCC for many years since childhood, but one of the challenges though is many of those churches are not open and affirming churches, so there's
That is true, although I will say in DC, we have a number of predominantly Black LGBTQ congregations, which is wonderful. And in fact, churches like Covenant that joined the UCC, originally Baptist, that is often the trigger that pushed them over into becoming part of us. Yeah.
How much have you tried to build a relationship with New York Avenue Presbyterian Church? I mean, we have an inside access to that.
Right.
They've been,
She's referring to our church administrator, who's a longtime member of New York Avenue Presbyterian.
and even Abraham Lincoln went, unless, but we have these contacts, and what are they trying to do? What is their experience?
Absolutely.
And any inner city white church is that people move to the suburbs because they don't want to have to cope with all this homelessness and this, that, and the next. But then you can say, what do we learn from striving for cope with homelessness? And what are the benefits to us and we don't ask that question very much.
I don't want to cut you off, Carol, but I do want, before we start losing people, because it is 12 after 1, and we try to keep these conversations to an hour, so people can actually eat lunch. So before other people have to leave, I want to thank both Bob and Richard so much. Really,
Thank you.
and we will look forward to getting the slides from you, and also just to being in touch with you. Really grateful for the work that you're doing, and hope that we can do our part in furthering things.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Yeah.
Appreciate it. Very thoughtful.
Oh, well,
Yes.
Well behaved.
Magda, Aurora, woo, woo, and Zachary, yes.
Well, Magda works on it, we're talking similar issues.
Absolutely, yeah, Magda.
Thanks, Richard.
Okay, thank
I'm gonna
you.
close the meeting off.
Take care.
Good luck this month.
Nice to meet you.
Congratulations on your time and energy going